custody order against her, but also subjecting her to years of gender-based violence and abuse, whereby she lost custody of her own children. He used an official Garda firearm to threaten her to put a gun against her head. Why is somebody like this, who had to resign from the Gardaí in ignominy and shame, brought back, years later for an exceptional award, a Scott Medal of Valour, the highest award you can get? Did the Taoiseach know about this? It was Micheál Martin who was Taoiseach at the time in 2021. And also, did the Minister for Justice at the time, Heather Humphreys, know about it? Heather made a great play about gender-based violence last week. She zero tolerance of it. Either she just presents things without checking who's behind them, or she knew about this person's history. We assume she just doesn't accept what's handed to her off a script, so she must have known. So I'll be asking questions of the Garda Síochána in particular about that, and I'll be asking them to revoke that Medal of Valour to that guard, and to apologise that it was ever presented. Unfortunately, it went under the radar at the time, it would seem, in 2021. Second issue I want to raise is the hunger strike that's shamefully still taking place, on the streets here. We're going to be going into a recess. We're going to be going into a presidential election. It really is beyond shameful if those victims of the state are going to be left out there by this government. It's very firmly in the hands of Fianna Fáil as well, who made promises. It was Bertie Ahern who promised them that they would be looked after when he brought in his redress scheme. And the Taoiseach has obviously met with them, and so has the Minister for Education. All of the things that the department or the Education Committee recommended has not been done for those survivors, and I think it is a shame. And then the last issue I want to mention is in Dublin 15, in my own area. There's 105 families who have eviction notices just in Dublin 15, and just families that have informed Fingal County Council, so there's obviously actually a lot more. I find that an absolutely shocking figure. I've never heard anything like that. A lot of these families, who my two councillors in particular are working with, have horrific stories. Some have children with cerebral palsy, with disabilities, with autism. They're facing eviction. They're facing going into homeless accommodation because they cannot find any other alternative. And there's two issues here. The issue is the cutting in half of Fingal County Council's tenant in situ budget from 40 million to 20 million. A number of these families were told there was no money left in the kitty to keep them in their homes, and that is firmly at the door of this government, at the Housing Minister and the Taoiseach. So I'll be raising that with Micheál Martin later. I've never heard of such a number of families in a small area of Blanchardstown to be faced with that prospect, and many others in homeless accommodation right now.
Just firstly, I want to briefly comment about the horrific story we're reading about. A man brought to court up in charges on sexual assault of a 10-year-old girl in City West in Saggart. Obviously, I'm aware that there's now a prosecution underway. I don't want to say anything that would endanger that prosecution, but obviously just to express our solidarity with the victim. It sounds utterly horrendous. The community is obviously in shock in relation to it. From what we're hearing, again without seeking to prejudice anything, it does appear that there are some questions for Tusla in terms of how a vulnerable girl in state care could end up in such a situation where an assault like this could take place. Obviously utterly horrific. Second point is in relation to the presidential election. I think what we've seen in the last 48 hours or so from Fine Gael is just desperation. They are scraping the bottom of the barrel at this stage in the hope of turning something up that will save the day for their candidate. I think their attack video, the line of attack featured in the Sunday Independent, is in the process of backfiring very, very badly for Fine Gael. I think people can see through it. It is an attempt, despite what they're now saying, it was very clearly an attempt to make former barristers responsible for the behaviour of their former clients. And Fine Gael will be more affected by that approach than any other party if people are to be made responsible for the behaviours of their former clients. So I think it's going down very, very badly. I think what it is doing is turning in the final days of this election campaign the focus onto the issue of housing and Heather Humphreys' record in relation to housing. And Heather Humphreys was part of a government that saw homeless numbers triple over the space of less than 10 years. Heather Humphreys on 7 occasions voted against reinstating the eviction ban and supported the lifting of that eviction ban, which is responsible for a massive acceleration of the numbers of people entering homelessness. So this isn't a question of Heather Humphreys acting on behalf of someone who was evicting people from their homes. Oh no, Heather Humphreys as government minister is directly, personally responsible for the eviction of people being thrown out onto the streets. And I think it's very welcome for the Catherine Connolly campaign that there will be focus on this in the debate tonight, presumably, and in the next number of days. I would say, in terms of trying to assess what's the Fine Gael attack ad about, which obviously is very American, very Trumpian in its style, in its tone. I think I heard, I didn't watch it now, but that Heather Humphreys herself had difficulty answering the question of who made this attack ad, and it's worth questioning further. But what is the purpose of it? Is it really aiming to win voters to Heather Humphreys? I don't really think so. I think this is a voter suppression ad. I think that is another tactic from the US. It's attempting to turn off working class and younger voters who are more deeply affected by the housing crisis from voting from Catherine Connolly. And that's our response will be obviously to focus on the housing crisis, Catherine's record on the housing crisis, but to attempt to turn people out in big numbers. And I have every confidence we'll be able to do that, pushing all the way to the line on Friday. We had a massive packed out gig last night in Vicar Street, a huge amount of energy from young people in particular that was sold out in half an hour. It's interesting to pose the question, how big a venue could have been packed by supporters of Catherine Connolly? I would suggest a very, very big venue. But our message is a positive message of turning out to vote, of defeating Fine Gael, defeating the political establishment, of creating momentum towards getting them, not just keeping them out of the Áras, but getting them out of government and electing Catherine to be president. Final point, just that in terms of issues that are emerging on the doors, the number one issue on the doors, apart from discussion around the presidential election, is the cost of living crisis. I think the government has miscalculated very badly here in terms of the budget they introduced the week before last, which is going to cut people's disposable income on average by 2.5%. For the lowest income people, it'll cut their disposable income by 4.5%. They're pushing more and more people into poverty. We saw the figures come out in terms of grocery inflation, 6.5% last week. The news was dominated by the energy bills. We're also hearing stories of what's called skimflation. So I learned last night that Penguin bars no longer have chocolate in them. They're chocolate flavoured rather than chocolate these days, because they're effectively it's a way of cutting costs while keeping the price the same but lowering the quality of goods. So you have actual inflation, you have shrinkflation, you have skimflation taking place across the economy, all driven by profiteering by major corporations. And the big question is the government going to do anything to protect people from this? And their answer last week was no, bluntly. Micheál Martin in Leaders' Questions in response to me said, well, what are you going to do to put pressure on the companies to lower prices? And we have proposals. We want nationalisation. At the very least we want price controls, which would stop the rip-off. But the government is saying very clearly they're not going to do any of those things and will leave people to the vagaries of the market, which is out to rip them off over the course of the winter.
Save the penguins. Campaign message coming from
Save the penguins, indeed. It's an animal rights question.
Housekeeping, first of all, Paul. We were trying to get endorsed to recruit Catherine Connolly yesterday. We asked the campaign when she would be out in reply. and Louise got onto your press officer Des, got no reply. He then contacted some journalists to invite them to the doors outside Leinster House yesterday, excluding some media. Is that appropriate?
I have no idea about any of those things, I'm afraid. So I literally know nothing about it. You're the person telling me about it. If you want to go and try and find out about it, I'm sure.
I just think it's
I'm sure there is a very, very good explanation. Catherine has been repeatedly answering questions, and I'm sure over the coming days we'll continue to do that.
To get to the bottom of that, great. Just on the campaign then. In 2016, Catherine Connolly was asked by one of her constituents if she was representing the banks in the possession case. She said that there was a scurrilous campaign against her, and then walked away without answering the question. Do you think that politicians have an onus to be honest with their constituents when they ask them straightforward questions?
Sure, politicians have an onus to be honest with their constituents, no question about it. Barristers, I understand, also have an obligation of confidentiality to their clients, which doesn't cease when their case comes to an end.
This wasn't about a particular case, it was about repossessions. And in today's Daily Mail I highlighted 5 occasions where Catherine Connolly said, I work as a barrister in abuse cases under a baby home. So she was able to talk generally about that, but she has refused to talk generally about repossessions purely because she feared political backlash. It's not relevant.
I mean, I think Catherine has been clear. This question has obviously come up a lot. I think Catherine has been clear in using formulations like, I worked on financial issues, I worked on both sides, barristers do that, and explaining the reality of the cab rank rule, which obviously the vast majority of us had never heard of the cab rank rule before, or we might have remembered it from the time that Fine Gael tried to smear Jim O'Callaghan in relation to it, explaining that you have to do work, you can't refuse it on political grounds and so on.
She wasn't honest with it. When she was asked about repossession, she was never clear about it.
I think she's been honest. I think she's repeatedly answered it and has been clear. I'm sure she'll be clear again tonight.
She said to her constituent there's a scurrilous campaign against her, which was asked very directly about it.
But I think there probably was a scurrilous campaign against her, attempting to smear her by suggesting that she was, in some way a hypocrite by being at that stage a left-wing councillor, later a left-wing TD, and speaking up against the banks, and yet having acted as a barrister previously, or at least that's what's said, for banks. She's not wrong to say there's a scurrilous campaign. This scurrilous campaign is still going on and has been amplified by Fine Gael in a massive way now. This is their final trick. So I don't consider that to be dishonest to say it's a scurrilous campaign.
At the same time, obviously the repossession of someone's home is something that's very traumatic. Is it difficult for you to have to defend Catherine Connolly's potential role in the repossession of people's homes now?
I think what's difficult is hearing about it. We had all this last week on the plinth as well. It's been going on a week. I was watching The Tonight Show. I think it went on for about 15 minutes of the entire show. And again, I've raised the question about Heather Humphreys there, and hopefully that will be pursued as well.
Can you give us the example?
I think she has said she worked for all sides. So what's the issue? The issue, the Minister for Justice came out yesterday and actually scotched the whole thing, I would have thought, saying that people had no right to attack somebody for working for, he's worked for all sorts as well. And the way the media are particularly, she has already made it clear she worked for all sides.
Not in the possession cases, she had not made that clear.
So do you think she actually defended people who are having repossession cases taken against them?
I thought she had worked for all sides in the whole situation.
No, she says I've worked in all cases, and I think she means everything, as in she's done all types of law. She actually hasn't specifically said ever about repossession.
Because you would expect her as a left-wing person to be sympathetic to people who have been protested against and threatened with eviction, the loss of their homes. So it would be a useful thing for her, from her own point of view, perhaps, to come out and say, yes, I also defend people who were subject to repossession proceedings.
But what we know is that while Catherine Connolly was a TD, for example, in the last previous Dáil, there were 7 occasions where there were votes on the eviction ban. I think in 1 or 2 of those she was in her position as Last Count Corla and therefore didn't vote. But in every occasion where she was available to vote, Catherine Connolly voted in favour of eviction bans. Heather Humphreys, in every single occasion, all 7 voted against an eviction ban. That's the political record, like, I think it's appropriate now the questions are being asked about Heather Humphrey's role as manager of the credit union, right? But I only think that's appropriate in the context of showing the hypocrisy of the attack. Look, Heather Humphreys was a manager of a credit union and they pursued certain things, but it's only relevant because they've attempted this line of attack to show, look, this is hypocritical. What we should look at is people's political records, what they stand for, as opposed to jobs that they previously did. Because let's be honest, like, if you're a criminal barrister, which I think Barry Ward mostly does kind of criminal work, presumably you're defending people accused of all sorts of things, murder, rape, and people are entitled to have lawyers, and if we go down this road, nobody's going to be able to get lawyers anymore.
The issue that we know that about Barry Ward. I mean, when he speaks in Dawes, he'll say, I'm a criminal barrister, for example. We didn't know that about Catherine Connolly, that she acted in possession cases, and she hasn't been clear about it. That really is the issue. Not the fact that she actually acted on it, the fact that she hasn't been clear about it. And I said that we give instances where she spoke about other work she did, but she has never said it. And because actually more than likely fears that it would be politically damaging for her.
But I don't think that's what the issue is here. I think if you watch the Fine Gael attack ad, but in terms of what the issue is, you're saying I'm telling you what the issue is for people on the ground. You read the Sunday Independent interview, you watch the Fine Gael attack ad. For them, certainly when they started this attack, the issue was that she was adding to people's misery. I can't remember the exact terms, but in the Sunday Independent, Heather Humphrey said, talking about that, about the substance of working for these banks. So they have now, because that's been exposed by Jim O'Callaghan and others, that like completely baseless, they've pivoted now to say, oh no, the real issue is, but that's the real issue is just the actual attack remains the same, which is to suppress voters by telling people Catherine isn't actually on your side on the housing crisis, she's on the side of the banks.
Because questions are being asked about this prior to this post being put out there, so I think you're being very selective here. This isn't just a Fine Gael issue. People outside of that in the media have been asking questions about this for a while and weren't getting clear answers. So while you say that Catherine Connolly's been very clear answer on all these questions, she actually hasn't been. I'd invite you to go back and look at her answers on it. She has not been clear on it.
I think she's been clear. Like I as a regular person, I haven't had a personal conversation with Catherine about this, but as a regular person who is watching the TV and the news, like, I understand what her answers mean. I have a fair idea of what her answers mean. I think the public know what her answers mean.
Well, I don't think they did, because the family we spoke to today were very surprised when they turned up in court and found someone that they voted for to be there to acting against them taking their home. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with her acting in that case, but I'm saying they were surprised as constituents of hers to find that out, and she wasn't forthcoming with other constituents when they asked her very clear questions.
But your article, and no problem, you're right to write the article, but come on, are you seriously saying the point of the article is to say, oh, she didn't declare it during the course of the election campaign, rather than the point of the article is a family who obviously, horrendous situation for them, no question, they lost their homes, but their criticism of Catherine Connolly is that she acted for the banks. But you're saying that's not really the point, when it's very, very clear that is what the point. And the problem is that there isn't a basis to that because of the reality of the role the barristers play, and therefore they've pivoted away to say something different is the issue. But that's the issue, and I think most people can see through that.
Are you pressing ahead with the defamation case against Heather Humphreys?
Yes, but I'm under instructions from lawyers not to say anything more about it than that. But yes.
Paul, just to go back to the Fine Gael video. In hindsight, going back to a number of years ago when repossession cases and the like came up in the Dáil, in hindsight, might it have been better, or might it have avoided this scenario if Catherine Connolly had just said, look, in general terms, I have represented banks in these cases, but here is my view on it?
I mean, I don't think so. I don't think this is an issue of a conflict of interest. If Catherine Connolly owned a bank, and then absolutely there would be a requirement, obviously, for that to be registered and for it to be declared. But the idea that when lawyers speak about anything, relates to any area of work that they've ever done, I don't really think that's necessary. It isn't followed by others. I mean, the point was made last night on the TV that Heather Humphreys, in her maiden speech, spoke in favour of relaxing regulations for credit unions and didn't mention the fact that she was manager of a credit union, which obviously we've heard about a lot in the course of the presidential election campaign. Barry Ward has not, on every occasion, declared that his involvement. So it isn't a normal practice, and I don't think it needs to be. And it's a
Paul, do you think the sudden change in her campaign and its more aggressive management on a party political basis would tend to suggest that if she were elected president, she would be beholden to the government of the day for the remaining 5 years of this government?
I mean, for me, that's always been clear. You have a choice between a president who's going to be a president for the government versus a president who's going to try to be a president for the people and be independent of the government. I think that's clear. I think what the latest line of attack it's just desperation, real desperation. But I genuinely think it's backfiring.
There's an awful lot of talk about there being negative campaigning on Dr. Humphrey's side of the campaign. And Catherine Connolly attended an event in Galway the weekend, and there was a big sign with a missile on it and pictures of Simon Harris and Micheál Martin with blood on their hands sitting on top of it. Is that something you support, and is that positive campaigning that you talk about?
Was this at the Limerick Palestine
Galway,
protest?
Galway, yeah.
And what was the context of it?
Galway, there was Catherine Connolly attended. She spoke at it. Look, I'll come back to later on if you haven't seen it. But I mean, is that type of having political figures with blood in their hands?
But I presume this is like a Palestine event or something, and people are graphically making the point about the complicity of the Irish government in what's happening in Palestine. We're over a year of an examination going nowhere into the overflights, where the bombs that are used, some of them, or parts of the F-35s, for example, have gone through illegally through our airspace, and the Irish government has done nothing about it. Looks like they're going to water down the Occupied Territories bill. So, I think it's fair enough for people to make graphic descriptions. It doesn't mean it's a thing that's done by the Catherine Connolly campaign or endorsed by Catherine Connolly.
Ruth, if I can just ask you just one question on a separate topic. You published or put forward legislation in the past couple of days about sex workers. Just what you want to see happen on that and where we are on that.
Okay, so it's at draft stage. It's being drafted primarily by sex workers themselves, and I'm, if you like, facilitating them. And it arises from the fact that there hasn't been a reduction in sex work since the last bill that the government brought in. Demand hasn't decreased by criminalising the purchase of sex, so that was meant to be the stated aim of that legislation. And the dangers, violence, threats of violence that sex workers face from clients and also from Gardaí in some situations has continued. So it's primarily aimed at safety of sex workers. So we'll be finalising it shortly and we'll fill you in then.
All right, thanks.